Well, here we are. There's me old mate here, me old copper, me in a suit and tie. No, I haven't come to my own funeral yet. I just thought I'd use a suit and tie to confuse you, and more importantly to mark the end of the year, end of 2021. Now what I'd like to talk about today, and my old mate here is going to help me, here's my old copper mate, is about the private con. The private confest, the private con. Now, in Australian society, being part of having a settler acquisitive mentality, everything that is private is good and everything that is public is bad. That's the mentality we see amongst people, and that's not their fault. To a significant degree over the last 40 to 50 years, we've had a persistent propaganda campaign against the most important element of Western civilization. And I'm not talking about spurious rights, but I'm talking about the fact that through the age of revolution in the 19th and early 20th century, what we saw was the state was forced to take into account the needs of the people. The state historically has been nothing more than a mechanism by which those who exercise power continue to exercise power. Whether it's through a secular totalitarianism or a religious-based totalitarianism, state has had total control. And its major function was to enrich those who control the means of production, distribution, exchange and communication. From the situation in the 17th and 18th century where most of the wealth in the Western world was derived from slaves and serfs, to the situation in Australia in 2021 where most of the wealth of this country is derived through wage slavery, not through investment as we're led to believe. Now, for many years, the state was forced through direct action, protests, campaigns, strikes, occupations, reform movements, revolutionary movements, to take an interest in the welfare of the people they controlled. Whether the state was totalitarian, whether it was a so-called democratic state, it was forced to take into account the interests of ordinary people, the great mass of people. And that was an exceptionally important change in the focus of the state apparatus, where things like public education became important, where educating future generations became important, where things like public health care became important, where the concept of universal health care became important, where the introduction of a social security net became more and more important, where the introduction of common infrastructure, which was used for the common good, became more important, and we saw more and more state resources which were derived from taxation in its various forms, whether it was personal taxation or whether it was taxation which was derived from customs duties, distributed not just among those who own the means of production, distribution, exchange and communication, not just amongst a religious hierarchy, not just amongst a hereditary hierarchy, but amongst ordinary people. And this was the century of change. We saw the state in the 20th century forced into providing essential services to people, not just essential services in terms of education and healthcare infrastructure, but essential services in case of taking control of energy production, telecommunications, ports, airports, and the list goes on and on. And although wages were relatively low, the amount of resources that a family had to expend on accessing essential services was minimal, because the state, through the public sector, provided these sectors through state-owned enterprises, which not only provide services but in many cases provided revenue back to the Treasury, which could be used to expand these services. So although this wasn't a period of milk and honey, it was a period where people felt relatively secure. It didn't come out of nowhere. Universal healthcare was not introduced in Australia until the Whitlam Labor government did in 1973 through the introduction of Medibank initially. Telecommunications and under the control of Telstra, the Snowy hydroelectric scheme, which provided essential services, gas infrastructure, electrical infrastructure, roads, all were provided through public money for the public good. So when did we start thinking of public services as second-rate, as not being able to compete with the private sector? We began to think in that way as a community when more and more people had enough disposable income to insure themselves against disaster through private health insurance, insure themselves against old age through a superannuation scheme, insure themselves in buying the best education money could buy, and the list goes on and on. So the higher the disposable income that sections of the Australian society had, the less the need for a universal services, because what public services are about is about universal services. It may be portioned out in respect of income, but it's universal. It's available to everyone who has that need at that particular point in time. Now, as more and more people had more and more disposable income to buy private health insurance, to access private education, and to access privately owned resources, whether it's aged care, early childhood development, and the list goes on and on, the push and shove came for the privatisation, that's right, the privatisation of essential services. And this push began during the beginning of the neoliberal revolution in the 1970s. And over the last 40 to 50 years, we have seen the wholesale privatisation of most aspects of the public sector. And the public sector is now reserved for those with urgent, immediate concerns. For example, public housing. Public housing was initially established after World War II to ensure that people who could not afford to buy a house in the private sector were adequately housed for a percentage of their income, 25%. Put the clock forward to 2021, public housing has now become the reserve of people in dire emergencies who find themselves homeless, who are fleeing domestic or social violence. Public housing is no longer available to people who cannot afford to buy in the private sector, with prices, average prices, median prices approaching $1 million in Melbourne and over $1 million in Sydney. What we are seeing is more and more income being used to pay rent and mortgages. Now, what happened is, as the class of people with disposable income increased, their pressures on the political system increased, and they increased exponentially. And they said, why are we paying taxes for people less well off than us? And this mentality grew that those who didn't earn as much, those who were on social security benefits, were somehow second-class citizens who didn't deserve a cradle-to-grave social security system. They didn't deserve access to decent public education, decent public housing, decent universal health care. And the push came to privatise the public sector. And the public sector was privatised in many ways. One way that was privatised was by selling essential infrastructure like electricity production, electricity distribution, the electricity network, the gas network, partial privatisation of water, all essential services. We saw the wholesale privatisation of the telecommunications sector, Telecom and Telstra. But when it came to creating the NBN, we found that the private sector was not willing to invest the money, and the money has been invested by the public sector on the understanding, well, once the NBN is established, that it will be privatised and handed back to the private sector. Then we saw a much more insidious and dangerous privatisation. We saw more and more state-based tax resources and federal resources being pushed into private education, and we now have the ridiculous situation in Australia where more federal money goes to the private education sector than the public education sector. And when you realise that most of the private education sector is run and managed by church-based and religious-based groups, you can understand that they use this income to prop up their crumbling empires as more and more people embrace agnosticism and atheism in this country. So why should we see public money going to private schools? We saw the same thing as far as public health is concerned. Now, if you want access to public health, if you have a serious medical condition or a serious health condition, most people with a serious health condition will not go to the private sector. If you're involved in an accident, you will find yourself in a well-staffed, well-equipped accident emergency centre run by the public sector. If you have complex medical needs that require intensive care, like COVID-19 and ventilation, you will find yourself in the public sector. If you've got a complex carcinoma, you will find yourself in the public sector. If your children have genetically related diseases or paediatric issues, you will find yourself in the public sector. And why is that? Because private medicine and private education are about one thing. It's about creating profits. It's about private investment for private profit. My old cobber mate here says, what's happened to this country? What's happened to this society? What's going on? Did I work all my life for nothing? Did I work all my life to see wealth go to the 1% that own the means of production, distribution, exchange and communication? Did I work all my life to see hard-earned taxes go to providing private education and private health? For example, $6 billion per year goes to the private health insurance industry. $6 billion. We have franking credits in this country where people get tax refunds for owning shares. We have negative gearing where people can offset losses on investment properties while other people can't even afford to pay the rent or pay their mortgage. So my old cobber mate here, who I found, lamenting here in the midst of nowhere, tells me, what have you done? What's going on? Then I told my old cobber mate, well, we've privatised all the ports. The port of Geelong, a regional Victorian town, is up for sale for $2 billion. We've privatised all the airports. And he said, how about me old mates at the Commonwealth Employment Service? Well, sorry mate, we've privatised that too, and we've put it in the hands of large corporations, many religiously affiliated, who are making billions of dollars of profit from putting people in dead-end jobs that go nowhere. You're kidding, he said. I said, no. And it's got worse. We've privatised the water system, that now water is a commodity, and we're seeing private investors and corporations manipulating the water market for short-term profits at the expense of farmers and irrigators. We've privatised massive sections of the healthcare system, in many instances the radiology services, wards help, ward staff, cleaners, kitchen staff. We've outsourced many aspects of Centrelink to private corporations. We even use private corporations to patrol outside military bases, as if the military didn't have enough muscle and people to actually patrol outside their own bases. That's how ridiculous the situation has come. We've got the situation where politicians at the federal level are talking about privatising the HECS debt. We've seen the privatisation of universities where they compete against each other for fee-paying students, providing a second-rate education and third-rate degrees to people who come here to learn. It's just extraordinary. You name it, it's been privatised. Now what people forget is, you may have a public service and public servants, but it's a three-tier system. You've got those in needs, you've got the public service, you've got the government of the day. And let's not forget, while we're talking about the public service, this current government has spent $2 billion paying outside consultants to provide advice they want to hear, instead of going to the public service to provide advice they may not want to hear. So we have this situation where public resources are wasted. In the private capacity, we have a private sector which provides disgusting aged care services for many Australians, and Royal Commission after Royal Commission has highlighted this. We've seen a stop-start vaccination system against COVID-19 because even that has been privatised. We saw the Victorian Health Department fall on its sword because it had no staff as far as social preventative medicine is concerned, and had to hire private security agents to manage COVID hotels, and the list goes on and on. So if you think private is good and public is bad, it's the other way around. Because in a private system, it's a four-tier system. You have the people who receive the service, it's usually the deserving poor, not the undeserving poor. Then you have the private company, and it's usually a corporation, which needs to make a profit from its investment. Then you have the people they hire to provide the service, and on top of that you've got the government giving them taxpayer money to carry out businesses which should have been carried out by the public sector to provide universal care, irrespective of social class, irrespective of occupation, irrespective of your state of health, religious belief. And at the same time everything is privatised. They tell you it's all right. We have these overseeing bodies which will ensure that the private sector continues to provide the services it has signed up to in the contracts we have given out to them. Then we're told these contracts are commercial in confidence, which means that the people who pay for the contract, which is the taxpayer, are not told what the contract is and what the profit margin is and how the services will be distributed. We saw this ridiculous situation with returning servicemen and women who are committing suicide at remarkable rates compared to the rest of the population, being offered piecemeal, part-time, private sector involvement to look after their healthcare, when we had a veterans hospital system which was created after World War II to look after the needs of veterans. Now they get a gold card and they're supposed to be treated in private hospitals. But the fact is that private hospitals are always interested in making a buck, because if you don't make a buck as a private institution, you fold. And so we see veterans with complex health issues, especially older veterans and those with psychiatric disorders, being channeled into an underfunded, under-resourced public health system. And the list goes on and on. So if you're sick of this privatised revolution, it is a revolution. It's a revolution based on four simple concepts. Deregulation. Remove all the regulations that are in place to protect people from employers, from exploiting the environment, from planning regulation. Just remove them. Let the private sector go out of the business. Don't put government in its way. Just let them do what they like so they can create a profit. Then we have the ridiculous situation of what's called corporatisation, where the essential endpoint of unbridled competition in a capitalist society is the formation of corporations. In this country we have 3 or 4 large corporations dominating every aspect of existence, whether it's hardware, whether it's hairdressing, whether it's general practice services, whether it's radiology, whether it's aged care, whether it's early childhood development, whether it's telecommunications. There's no competition in a corporatised economy. Then we have globalisation, and we are now seeing the effect of that globalisation. We were able to keep this economy ticking over by exploiting overseas workers who we brought here on short-term contracts and short-term visas to exploit their labour, put downward pressure on wages, and increase the non-unionised workforce in this country. And now, with COVID-19, we have seen how dependent we are on the exploitation of overseas labour. And finally, we have the final nail in the coffin, which continues to be nailed in the coffin of our society, and that is privatisation. Now, I can talk about this as long as I like. I could sit here with my cobber friend here for another 6 hours and bore the pants off you, but I'm not going to do that, because it doesn't matter what I say or how erudite I am or how stupid I am. The fact is, this will not change unless you get off your arse. I'm sitting down, I'm on my arse. Nothing will change unless we get off our arse and fight back against the privatisation tsunami which has ruined this country, which has brought tears to my old cobber's face. And one organisation I can recommend you join, as I'm the registered officer, is Public Interest Before Corporate Interests, which runs this YouTube presentation. Now obviously we've been asking for members for a long time. We need your membership in order to be registered as a Victorian political party, so we can actually stand candidates at the next Victorian state election in November, at the end of November in 2022. Currently, we found ourselves frozen out of the federal election campaign because with a stroke of a pen, the Liberal National Party and the Labor Party jointly supported legislation with increased membership numbers for registered political parties at the Commonwealth level from 500 to 1,500. This means that over 70 to 80% of current registered political parties will be deregistered. This means there's little competition at the ballot box. This means we will get more of the same: privatisation, corporatisation, globalisation and deregulation. The ball is in your court. If you're sick and tired of what's happened in 2021 and you want real change, then I suggest you join Public Interest Before Corporate Interest today. Download the application form from PIBCI.net. If you don't join today, think about it. Look at the website, PIBCI.net. Look at the website. If you're interested, join. If you're not interested, don't complain to me about all the negative consequences of privatisation, globalisation, deregulation and corporatisation. I've heard it all before, and I know without action from you, nothing will ever change.